Good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the country you're joining us from. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders at the intersection of science and culture for meaningful and relevant programs about mental health. The Open Mind is proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and our friends at the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my honor to welcome Jonathan Rosen, the author of the critically acclaimed memoir, The Best Minds, a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions that was named a top 10 best book of the year by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Slate, and People magazine, and it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The Best Minds also has the distinction of being on Barack Obama's list of top 10 favorite nonfiction books of 2023. Best Minds is a haunting investigation of the forces that led the author's closest childhood friend, Michael Laudor, from the heights of brilliant promise to the forensic psychiatric hospital, where he has lived since killing the woman he loved. In this magnificent and heartbreaking account of good intentions and tragic outcomes, Jonathan Rosen explores the ways in which we understand and fail to understand mental illness. In addition to The Best Minds, Jonathan is the author of 2 novels, Eve's Apple and Joy Comes in the Morning, and 2 other works of nonfiction, The Talmud and the Internet, A Journey Between Worlds, and The Life of the Skies, Birding at the End of Nature. His essays and articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous anthologies. He is joining us from his family home in New York City. We are also honored to have with us Dr. Carrie Bearden, professor in the departments of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences, Psychology, and the Brain Research Institute at UCLA. Dr. Bearden's research focuses on identifying underlying genetic and biological vulnerability markers for serious mental illness. I'm also very proud to say that Dr. Bearden serves as the faculty advisor for the Friends of the Semel Institute. Now, before I go into the few housekeeping notes we have on behalf of the Friends and Resnick boards, I would like to thank both Jonathan and Carrie for taking the time for their busy schedules to join us today. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, we ask that you please type it into the Q&A that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have over 2,000, actually 2,024 people registered for today's program. So you can imagine we're going to get a lot of questions, but we will do our very best to get to as many as possible in the time allotted. Today's program is being recorded. It will be available for viewing on our website, friendsofsemelinstitute.org, starting tomorrow. You'll also find there a calendar of upcoming programs, videos from past programs, information about our Friends Research Scholar Program, the Teen Advisory Council, and their Gen Z Wellness Summit that will be held on Sunday, March 2nd at UCLA. WOW, the Open Mind, the Resnick and Friends joint fundraising event that will be held in September 2025 at the Crypto Arena, and the Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held on April 27th at UCLA. Don't expect you to remember all these dates, but please visit our website, friendsofsemelinstitute.org, where you will find all of these events listed. Now, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Jonathan Rosen and Dr. Carrie Bearden. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vicki, for the introduction. And Jonathan, what an honor it is to be here with you tonight. So I want to thank you not only for being here, but for writing this really extraordinary book. And what I think your book does so well is that it's this deeply personal story that is embedded in this historical and societal context, but you articulate it in a way that's so engaging for the reader. So I thought we could start at the beginning, really with why you wrote the book and what that journey was like. I understand it took you many years to actually write it. So wondering if you could tell us about that process and what led you to actually commit to writing it.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vicky, for that wonderful introduction. And it's an honor to be here. And I'm always taken by surprise by the most direct question, which is why I wrote the book, because so much of my own life was bound up in it. And probably also because I spent as long a time not writing the book as I did writing it. As you heard, as Vicky said, that it was about my friend who was very brilliant, and who was my best friend in childhood killed someone. And so I probably spent a long time in like inner flight, I think, from the tragedy of his story, and only came to feel over time how much lay on the other side of that tragedy. And so, in a way, the impulse to write the book was initially just an impulse to have a reckoning, both with what happened, with my own reaction to what happened, and then with all that had happened before then, including my friendship. And so I really looked back over my whole life, as I say. And one of the things I guess I'll do is just kind of give a little description of how I set about framing the book, because in a way, it did take me a long time. It took me 10 years to write the book. And I was continually asking myself that question: why am I writing it? What am I writing? And how how faithful am I being to a story I wasn't even sure I could have defined, because I was telling initially the story of a friendship, but a story of a friend who became very ill, and then a story of how society failed him, and then a story of the tragic outcome. But one of the things I would say is that in 1995, when Michael had graduated from Yale Law School, which he went to despite schizophrenia. Um, he was profiled in the New York Times, and it was this heroic profile of a role model genius, which was enormously inspiring for many people. 3 years later, he had killed Carrie. He was on the cover of all the tabloids under lurid headlines, Psycho, with twice he was on the cover. And I often thought that if I had encountered Michael's at his story on the cover of the Post, I would have had no idea who he was. And if I encountered him in that heroic portrait, I would also have had no idea who he was. And somehow uh, I needed to go back beyond both of those to childhood. I didn't want the story to simply be a tragic inevitability told backwards, though I initially thought that's what I would do. But in the end, I realized I would go back to childhood. And so my book begins literally with the words, "I am going back." And it begins in 1973 when I moved to New Rochelle, which is a suburb of New York City. If anybody ever watched the Dick Van Dyke Show, that's where Dick Van Dyke lives. Um, it's a real place for a mythical character. Michael and I lived on the same street. We were 10 years old. The street had about 7 houses on it. Uh, I met him, if not the first day, then the second. We became friends immediately. We both played basketball. We were both very tall. Our fathers were both professors. Michael was brilliant. I had dyslexia, always concealing what I didn't read or know. Michael, who was all overtness, read incredibly fast. He had a photographic memory. He could recite vast passages of literature. And I divided my book into 4 houses, and the first house is the house on Maryland Road. It's my house. It's Michael's house. We walk to school every day. And it's kind of that suburban world. Then the second house is the house of psychiatry. It was a real house in New Rochelle, beautiful house, actually built by Cecil B. DeMille back when the movie industry was centered in Westchester. And it was lived in by 2 psychiatrists who were steeped in community psychiatry. And they would ultimately play a very large role in Michael's care. But Michael called it the Gatsby House, and we both wanted to be writers. He lived in the attic writing stories after college. We both went to Yale. Michael graduated in 3 years. I did not. And his goal was to work at a management consulting job. He was recruited at Yale to do that. He was a brilliant talker. That's what they loved. He was going to work for 10 years and then just write. I didn't have a plan, but I also wanted to be a writer. But already after the first year, he began to suffer delusions, hallucinations. It was the beginning of what would culminate in a psychotic break several years later. But I had no idea. And I thought he had just decided to be a writer early. And he lived in the attic of this house. And eventually, because they were psychiatrists, they furnished him with care. They found psychiatrists for him because he had a psychotic break. And I remember visiting him in a locked ward at Columbia Presbyterian, where he spent 8 months. And from there, he went to a halfway house, but he had already applied to all the law schools in the country, got into all of them. While he was in this locked ward, told his brother, reject them all. That's how Michael talked about the world, but defer Yale. And from the halfway house, he went to Yale Law School. And so the third house is the House of Law. These are all real places, like the House of Psychiatry is really a house. The House of Law is Yale Law School, which was very accommodating, very welcoming to Michael. In a way, it was a kind of asylum for him. It gave him asylum, and he spoke about it as the greatest healthcare facility in the country. His professors, who were his mentors and who I talked to in the writing of the book and who were enormously engaged in the project and very helpful to me, understood, as I did not at the time, that he could not actually do the work, but they felt how brilliant he was. And so in a way, they were accommodating him. It became a problem, though, because in his mind, he was becoming a Yale lawyer. In their minds, he was becoming someone who had been to Yale Law School and could become an advocate. But many of those professors of law had clerked for the judges who had changed the institutionalization laws. And so they were themselves involved in unweaving the world that when Michael needed it wasn't there. And so for them, it was a reckoning with the way psychiatry had changed. And all of these changes, and psychiatry had changed because the law changed it. And so one of the things I didn't know, and I didn't know almost anything when I started, was how fully law and psychiatry kind of entered into a partnership. And so, again, they're not hermetic houses. The House of Law and the House of Psychiatry, they visited each other. Let's put it that way. And then, calamitously, Michael, after this glowing profile in the New York Times, his life, which was already a story he himself told, that was a heroic representation of himself, not wholly of his illness, but it was bought by Ron Howard, movie producer, to be a movie. Brad Pitt was going to play him. And the fourth house is the House of Dreams, is Hollywood. And Michael was going to write his own story for a publisher, and Hollywood was going to make the movie. He stopped taking his medication. He killed Carrie. And that very month, A Beautiful Mind was excerpted in Vanity Fair. Ron Howard bought that and turned it into the movie A Beautiful Mind, which had its origins in a movie that was going to originally be the heroic story of a young man who went to Yale Law School despite his illness and seemingly triumphed over it. And so those are the bare outlines. And as I say, all the houses, which were just containers for this story, are leaky vessels. I mean, the dreams of childhood very much influenced how we grew up. Psychoanalysis, which was the dominant mode for psychiatrists, doesn't just interpret dreams. In a way, it had its own dream of healing that shaped both the lives of both of our parents, because we grew up in these homes that had been shaped by psychoanalysis. They influenced law, which influenced psychiatry, and all of them helped shape a Hollywood story with a happy ending, which was in its own way both a very noble thing to do and a falsification of the nature of the struggle he was engaged in. And so that's an extremely long answer to why I wrote the book. I would only say that I discovered along the way, as you mentioned, so much of the story was shaped by the culture we grew up in, post-60s, 1970s. And so folding that into the story was part of the challenge, and realizing that I had to untell stories as well as tell them. And somehow I sometimes feel I'm still holding a pen as I speak. I sometimes feel like I'm still ready to write down a revision or an addition.
In some ways, yeah, their story is still being written. Well, I have so many questions, but I think maybe I'll start with just, that it's a book that has so much significance for what it has to tell us about how our society approaches questions of mental illness. And you weave in the societal and historical context so well into this Michael story. And so just in terms of thinking about how these systems in our society relate to people's lives and what they can tell us about how to make things better for people that need help. And you raise throughout the book, I mean, this really important, what you've touched on here, this really important point about the irony of, Michael had very idealistic people throughout his life, people who were involved in, community psychiatry, his law school professors, people who really, really wanted the best for him. And so this, the clause in your title, the tragedy of good intentions, honestly really haunts me. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, about what may have gone wrong in terms of, these people with really the best intentions.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add to that is that one of the reasons that I also decided to go back and tell the story forward is because merely looking back over it, it was very easy to become enraged at how many systems had simply been destroyed rather than reformed. And it is enraging. But I also understood that a lot of the people making these decisions with the best intentions were making them inside of real time and had been shaped by what had come before them. And so it's true that when psychiatric hospitals were built in the middle of the 19th century, the alternative was being considered demonically possessed, living in a true snake pit, sometimes being whipped, locked, in closets or basements, chained. And so they really were a tremendous improvement and a civic responsibility that was accepted by all the states. But in the age that the psychiatrists I'm writing about grew up in, they had fallen on dreadful times. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, there were photo spreads in Life magazine, and that made the pictures look almost like the photographs of liberated concentration camps that had also run in Life magazine. And so in that recoiling from something that for a lot of reasons, including overcrowding because of the war itself, because also half of all the people who worked in them had been drafted. They looked and were much, much worse. They had also begun setting up satellite programs, but the impulse of these psychiatrists to treat them almost like the Bastille and knock them down and start again was both understandable, but it was also, in retrospect, a disastrous thing to do. So there was that. The community-oriented psychiatrists who were caring for him saw themselves as saving him from the system rather than his illness, rather than addressing his illness. So there was also that. It also happened that in the 60s, as I sometimes say, even actually already in the 50s, psychiatrists had antipsychotic medication, which was new on the scene in like 1954. That was the same year LSD was sent to psychiatrists to experiment with. And so, you had a drug in one hand that could suppress hallucinations and delusions, and you had a drug in the other that induced them. And, on the one hand, as I say, it was only a matter of time before they got mixed up, but also by the 60s, the culture itself had spoken, and they decided that the one that induced hallucinations were mind expanding. And that the people who naturally had hallucinations or delusions must be like prophets or visionaries. And so the society itself was already bound up in a fantasy of what it was like for people to suffer from a severe mental illness. They made it a metaphor. R.D. Laing, very influential psychiatrist, who famously said that schizophrenia is the only sane response to a mad world, was enormously influential in the lives of the people providing his care. And so for all of those reasons, there was an impulse to make it not just harder to hospitalize people who needed it, but to make the very idea of hospitalization itself somehow seem like the greater intrusion on than medication, than care, than a certain kind of acknowledgement of the illness itself. And the law professors I all talked to, who had clerked for these judges in the 50s and 60s, they simply saw it as an extension of the civil rights movement. And so for them, tearing down the wall was like ending segregation, which they had themselves been deeply involved in. And so it was an extension. If they examined the metaphor too closely, it was profoundly unflattering to everybody that you would see them simply segregated for racial reasons, and similarly that you would make racial segregation connect that to the hospitalization of people with an illness. Nevertheless, that was the reigning idea. And again, because segregation was so dreadful and was the great judicial victory of their early lives, they wanted to do the same thing. And so there again, the systems were dismantled. And so one of the reasons I was actually able to write the book, I mean, a motivation for it was speaking to the daughter of the owner of the House of Psychiatry, who remembered talking to her mother right before Michael killed Carrie. That was the name of his fiance. And she heard from her mother that Michael was hallucinating, that he was delusional, that he didn't always recognize Carrie, that he thought she was a space alien. And she said to her mother, "What are you going to do about it?" And her mother said, "There's nothing we can do." And there was something so haunting about that answer, both for this woman who told me the story and who wanted me to tell this story. So she loved her mother, who was an extraordinary woman, but she had grown up with inside of that tragedy, and she wanted to understand it, and she helped me understand it from the inside, because there was a whole circle of people around Michael who cared about him enormously, but who felt they were honoring his autonomy, which is an important thing to do, but they were actually facilitating his illness. Even, by the way, with the law professors who assumed, even though he couldn't do the work, that they were bestowing on him a kind of secure future. And so that's the tragedy of good intentions. And I think we're still living in the aftermath of many broken systems. I know we are, actually.
Right. Absolutely. And, one other aspect that I've just been reflecting on is the role that Michael's intelligence played in his outcome. In general, having a high IQ is a protective factor for people with serious mental illness. Tending to have better prognosis for recovery. And certainly that seemed to be the direction things were heading for Michael, culminating with his portrayal in the New York Times of having conquered his illness. I'm wondering if you think in some ways his intellect maybe contributed to this outcome, because it led for those around him, particularly his treatment providers, to either downplay or not take seriously the likelihood that he could become violent or act on his delusions.
I think it definitely played a role. I think it also played a role in his ability to present himself as doing okay, because he could speak about his own illness. He was a wonderfully persuasive talker, and he would tell his professors about his hallucinations. They knew almost nothing about severe mental illness, and they were absolutely fascinated by it. And in their minds, the story Michael told about his how every morning his father would talk him out of bed because he thought his bed was on fire. And his father would say, "Put your hand in the fire. Is it hot?" No. He told them all that story. They all told that story to each other, and they all told that story to me. And to them, it was a story, I think, almost about someone like themselves, who was helping him every day reconstitute himself. But that was just one story, and it already had a kind of emblematic force. But when one of the law professors, the dean of Yale Law School, was talking to his daughter, who I knew, she went to Yale too, who was becoming a psychiatrist and working with mentally ill homeless people in Boston who slept under bridges, who lived outdoors, who did not believe they were ill, her father told her one of the stories about Michael, and she said, "Dad, you have no idea what you're talking about."
Mm.
And they both told me that story from their own perspectives. And so that's another feature. One was, as far as Yale was concerned, he was inside the charmed circle of intellect, which bestowed a kind of blessing on you. And when Michael and I were kids, even though I had all my learning disabilities, being smart was enormously important. We didn't think we would do anything particular with being smart. We weren't going to help the world or anybody. It was just like an inoculating um, force that would save you. And so he was naturally smart, but it was a thing to aspire to. And so you really did feel, well, he's been saved. And he himself used to say, "I may be crazy, but I'm not stupid." Um, and there was a way in which I think even his professors, who were uh, wonderful people early in the meritocracy, they had threaded that incredibly hard needle to come from where they'd come from, um, gone to Yale or Ivy League schools, gone to Yale Law School. And so they really believed in the salvational power of brains. The thing that I had to stop and painfully consider is why that should be the reason why people pay attention to you. I mean, the fact that intellect had become the unit of measurement almost to determine worth back already in the progressive era at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, when IQ tests were invented, immediately used to decide if they could sterilize you. If you were inside the circle of acceptability, no, you were in. You had all the protections. But outside, you were not. The soul had ceased to be the unit of worth by which we measured people. And that was very painful for me because I had grown up inside of that world. And my parents loved me very much. They would not have abandoned me, but I was very conscious of hiding my own inability to read as I felt I needed to. And I often thought, if I were ill, how would they treat me? What would that say? And realizing that I was inside an entire world constructed on not an entire world, but many elements of it had a great faith in your intelligence. So for all of those reasons, nobody felt they could tell him what to do. And I myself was so used to the authority of his intellect that when I visited him in the locked ward after his psychotic break, and he told me to bring a Bible or a book about the Bible, but to hide it because the guards wouldn't. I was busy doing all those things until my then girlfriend, now wife, said, "They will let you into the hospital with that book." But he always knew what he was talking about. So, uh, and that was for sure. It's a very interesting question, and I don't, of course, know how to answer it fully, but it's a piece of it for sure.
Yeah, yeah. One other, and this sort of actually what you just said gets to another question that I had, where I think one of the themes in the book, particularly in the early days, is, just the social comparison or competitiveness, that you felt with Michael, which is really relatable. I think for all of us, when you have a best friend who you view as, being really, really good at something. And so growing up, this feeling that he was maybe better at various things that you valued, like reading, really processing information really quickly, and maybe his gregariousness as well. And so, can you talk a little bit about how that relationship with Michael evolved over time, particularly as you were witnessing him becoming ill?
Well, in high school already, in retrospect, though never at the time, it's entirely possible that he was already suffering from certain early symptoms. And our friendship had become fraught. It was so rooted in its sibling closeness that even it was easy to not notice, in a sense, when things were strange. But uh, we both wanted to be the editor in chief of the high school newspaper. But when I was asked, would I work with Michael if he was the editor, I told the faculty advisor, of course. When he was asked, he said, no, he couldn't possibly. And he told me that as if I would share his sense that it would be, in fact, a dreadful thing. And so when I did become editor, I was sure I would not be because he would get us both if it was Michael. Michael did quit. And yet he'd come to the office every day and sit in it. And so it seemed now to me as if he was imprisoned by a certain idea of himself that, and more things like that, more intense. But then we went, and we both got into Yale, and I had a sense I'd finally learned to drive. I think his brother was teaching him how to drive when he was like not 12, but as he told it, very, very young. I got my license at the last possible moment. And then we were both going to go to Yale. And we used to hang out on my parents' patio. And before we went, he said, I don't think we'll see much of each other. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, you're too slow. And in a way, there, even when he was like had quit his job, I always thought of him as the hare merely resting, where I was, even if I was going fast, I was like a tortoise who had hailed a taxi. And it took quite a while to recognize that he wasn't merely resting. And when I visited him, I was in graduate school in California. I went to Berkeley to get a PhD in English. I left. Um, but it was a devastation to see him so denatured by his illness, someone who had just been a touchstone of high mental functioning for me, and even of, for many people, overwhelming arrogance. For me, just a kind of wonderful assertiveness that I was happy to be with, because he kind of parted he was like an icebreaker, and you could float behind him for a while when we were younger. And so that was a dreadful experience in a sense. I'm also not proud of how I responded, and I did visit him, but I was frightened. And I also, in a sense, it had an effect on my graduate school education, because I'd been reading a lot of Foucault. You had to, for some reason, in those days, read Madness and Civilization, very, very influential Foucault book, even if you were studying literature. The premise there is that mental illness is entirely socially constructed, and it's devised by society simply for the purpose of demonizing or othering anyone who doesn't fit in. And that even hospitals or asylums were created in the 18th century so that there would be a place to put the people that were then rounded up simply because of their difference. And I was with him for about 30 seconds when I understood that he was not suffering from a social construct, and that social constructs are true and fascinating and important, but that an entire system of literary study based on a falsification of almost biological experience was symptomatic of a detachment from the world itself that was bound up with the theoretical orientation of my education. So I'm not saying that's why I left, but I am saying that it was a revelatory moment for me, and powerful, but also in his remarkable way. Michael, once again, was in a halfway house, but he'd already gotten into Yale and was already going to go. He was going to go because although the doctors suggested a more modest way for him to begin re-entering society, working at Macy's, for example, which is what they suggested, his father took him to the biggest Macy's. I mean, to the Macy's in Manhattan, which literally says the biggest department store in the world on the side of it. And it was not a commonplace, it was frenzied. And Michael would always say, why would I work at Macy's when I can be a Yale lawyer? So it seemed to me, once again, because of the story he told, and telling stories was also something we both believed in and did, that he was obviously okay, even though that's what made it so painful to hear one of his law professors say, I never thought he'd become a Yale lawyer. I thought he would become someone who had gone to Yale Law School, because Michael was always saying, why would I do this when I can be a Yale lawyer? So even there, discovering that their good intentions helped create a space between what was real and how he saw what was real, which was the very problem that he suffered from at times, was ultimately quite tragic in a way.
Yeah, I think the societal context, that, the time in which, this all takes place is so important. This shift, which, you talk about so well in the book, and which you've touched on here, just, this this idea that mental illness is a social construct, leading to this romanticization of mental illness. So where do you think we are now as a society in terms of perception of mental illness?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I'll add one thing about the societal context, which has to do with my own story that I weave in, because no one told me that there were many kinds of mental illness. There was only when I was growing up or when I was kind of discovering myself in college, let's say, and in the aftermath, a generic, bland, all-encompassing term called mental illness. And so I suffered enormously from anxiety. And when I finally, at one point, discovered, because I had someone left a copy of Listening to Prozac in the lobby of my building, oh my goodness, here is something, maybe I'll try it, although I smuggled it up to my apartment. I mean, I was an adult, but somehow, having grown up as I did, it seemed like cheating. A, it was a bestseller, and my mother, who's a writer, frowned on bestsellers. B, it told you that you might be able to alter how you've experienced the world, not simply by psychoanalytically retrieving the disturbing moment from childhood. But in any case, it was life-changing for me to discover there were ways I could address being as anxious as I was. Nevertheless, so for that very reason, almost, I always would think of Michael as also having, or he had a mental illness. If someone told me I had to take medication, I would be enraged. I wouldn't even want them to know. If someone told me I had to stop, I would feel the same way. So no one explained to me that 1% of the population suffers from a particular form of severe illness, and of that 1%, there are a percentage of people who don't believe they're ill and who don't therefore accept medication, even if it could help them. And so um, when you would read a statistic, as one often did in the newspapers, that half of all Americans will suffer from mental illness, it is in no way to diminish the intensity of the suffering of people with anxiety and all forms of mental discomfort. But it was all treated in the same way, so that when psychiatric hospitals, state hospitals, were dismantled, they were not even replaced by things that used the word mental illness. They were replaced by community mental health centers, because they were not even for people who had mental illness. They were for everyone, because a misapplied public health notion that somehow everyone would pass through and there would be a place for everyone in a catchment area, and then they would all go as if they could then literally be inoculated. And therefore, and this really was the argument made before Congress by psychoanalysts who should have known perfectly well that they couldn't prevent severe mental illness. But in any case, the whole model was an extension of the very form of psychiatry, which was psychoanalysis, no longer necessarily being used, but now being used to create the very system in which people were being treated. So if you went, you wouldn't get ill. And if you were ill, there was medication, not that psychoanalysts had ever given it, because that was not an interest of theirs. Nobody thought about how people would comply. Nobody thought what it meant that when Michael wasn't taking his medication, he was not only convinced he wasn't ill, he was convinced that people who were trying to help him were trying to harm him. He thought his parents were Nazi replicas of his real parents. That is so different from the realm of experience that many people associate. Now, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be attention to all those things, but it was just that a system for the most ill was built based on a definition that really applied to everyone. And in a way that meant not necessarily that no one was going to get helped, but the people from whom almost the metaphor of severe illness was borrowed were the ones least likely to be helped. And so is that where we are now? I don't think so. I notice more and more people speak of severe mental illness as a way of making that distinction, and that is quite important, because I think that maybe people would find it unhelpful, but for me, I was so ignorant about what mental illness was that getting my education was enormously important to me. And so, by the way, was recognizing that a diagnosis does not need to be something stigmatizing, because it holds out actually the promise that there are things that can be done. And I find that very powerful. And I've talked to many, many people for whom that has been true, as it seemed to be true for Michael for a time.
Yeah, that really brings me to, since I mean, this is such a tragic story, but just wanting to turn to what you think could be done differently. I'm sure you've thought a lot about this in terms of Michael's history, in terms of perhaps changing systems and structures or earlier intervention, perhaps. Just what are your thoughts about ways that to possibly avoid outcomes like
Yeah.
Michael's?
I definitely think earlier intervention, had it been possible, would have been enormously helpful. There were years in which, before he had his full psychotic break, he was living inside of a semi-delusional world. And if there had been a way for people to address it sooner, um, it would have, I believe, been enormously helpful. It also, I think, would have been helpful. I know it would have been helpful and essential if, when he was no longer allowing Carrie into his apartment because he thought she was an alien and didn't believe she was who she said she was, that was understood automatically as an occasion for either um, presenting him with the choice of finding a way, very important to find a way to work with him to get him to return to the medication that had helped him, but if not, to hospitalize him for a time. And those things were somehow not even on the table, although an intervention team had come by and he had come to the door and taken their card and sent them on their way. And so, in a sense, it raises the most difficult of questions, which is he would have to have been helped at a certain point against his will by people who felt that they were helping him the way, if I lost consciousness on the sidewalk, I would hope that you would call an ambulance for me, even if you didn't know if I had passed out, had a stroke, had a heart attack, was just lying face down, and by then it wasn't even only that the laws were often didn't allow it, but the very culture made it seem like it would be violating um, his rights when in the end it would not have been. And I'll tell this last story on myself because it haunts me. A few weeks before Michael killed Carrie, we were making a plan to get together, as we sometimes did. He always canceled, but we would make the plan. And he suddenly said to me, I have to go now. I'm having thoughts I shouldn't be having. And so I let him go. At that point, it did not occur to me at all that that might mean that he was in a dangerous place for himself. Um, it was ignorance, probably fear, and just a sense that I had no place even asking myself that question.
These questions of personal autonomy are certainly it's so challenging. The idea of coercing Michael to take medication, seems really counter to the way we like to think about treatment approaches. And so it sounds like, in retrospect, you do feel that would have been a better way to go, although it's always hard to know, I realize.
It's always hard to know. The one thing I would say is that when I was working on the book, it seemed like there was a very stark distinction between community care and the hospital. But the hospital often doesn't even have beds, and the community was not set up to serve people like Michael.
Mm.
More and more, though, with assisted outpatient treatment, with supportive housing, where you can get care and live autonomously, but also not live alone as he was with someone, but so many of the things he did are like the worst. If you made a list of all the things you shouldn't be doing, isolation. So, in a way, as psychiatry itself, to my mind, puts itself together, that there is a way in which a combination, it's not as if now only medication can cure everything. It can't. People need to be listened to. They need to speak. Um, there aren't big hospitals, nor should there be. There should be beds for anyone who needs them for as long as they need them. And it should be covered by the government, which it's not, which is a whole extraordinary, painful exclusion intent by design, so that the states would not be in charge of it. It's a complex thing but in any case, I do feel that a coming back together now of an idea of what it might mean to create in-community services that take seriously the needs of the severely ill people, is what is effective. It's a very small beginning now, but it does seem to work in the cases in which it works. But I don't know what, if anything, would have changed the tragedy that I tell.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for just a wonderful, insight into the book.
And
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I want to thank you, Jonathan, for writing this book and sharing this gripping and haunting story about your childhood friend Michael, his journey, his brilliance and journey into madness. And you really told it with great compassion and insight into severe mental illness, which, as you said, wasn't talked about, and is, and needs to be talked about and as a human condition. And Carrie, thank you for so skillfully moderating this discussion and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with all of us. We do have quite a few questions, so I'm going to just dive right in. Our first question is, where's Michael today? Do you see him? Has he read the book? And what's his impression of it, if he has?
I somehow feel, I won't say the name of where he is, although it's in the book, I guess. But he's in the same forensic psychiatric hospital he's been in for more than 25 years. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was hospitalized first in order to stand trial. That was a remarkable thing for me to even understand what that might mean, that having killed someone, then he was getting both hospital care and medication that he needed. And when he was eventually sort of seemingly fit to stand trial, still, he was found not responsible. And so, because it was found that he, at the time of the killing, genuinely believed that he was being pursued by someone who he felt was trying to kill him. And so he's in the same forensic psychiatric hospital. I have visited him. I haven't visited him for a while. It's bound up with the nature of his illness. He has not read the book. He has never acknowledged, at least with me, that he killed someone. And so it would not be, it wouldn't make sense, I think. And I never interviewed him for that reason. It was clear to me that he didn't. And so he gets care, and he has been there so long that it feels like the place where he is, but that could always change, since he's not there as a punishment. He's there because it's the care. He needs to be there so long as he is not able to acknowledge what he did, and so long as he needs to acknowledge both his illness and the fact that he killed somebody. Those two things together. I long thought that it would be a source of madness for me alone to recognize that I killed the person I love most in the world, but that's its own hell. And so I understand the question very much, and I would ask it myself first. I would also just add, although it's not in the question, that I didn't know Carrie, but it was very important to me to make her very present in the book. And so she is someone who is friends and family I spoke to, so that I could represent her. And that is, even though it is the story, an extension of a world that I lived in when I was a child, it's also peopled with people who I didn't even know at the time I was writing the book, but hope I made present respectfully and in their vivid fullness. Although, of course, Carrie is no longer here.
I think that speaks to the great compassion and care you took in writing this story, that not having known her, but really got to know her through her family and friends, and told her story. We have another question here, and it's kind of for both of you, about were there signs as when he was a child, anything looking back now that would make you wonder? And Carrie, what are the signs that people should pay attention to especially in adolescence?
Sure. I'll let you go first, Jonathan.
Okay. So the caveat is, of course, that it's sort of, if you read that an illness causes night sweats and fever and sleeplessness, you have it. And I'm going to leave it to an expert like Carrie to describe it in its, clinical complexity. But one of his early elementary school teachers who remembered him very vividly. She didn't remember me at all, but she could describe him down to his auburn eyelashes. Said, if I had known anything, I would have thought he would become schizophrenic, which astonished me. But first of all, what she said was, who reads Lord of the Flies in 5th grade? Because I feel like I had read Lord of the Flies because he told me the entire plot. But also, he would sit with stacks of books on his desk and read them during class randomly, as if one book was a piece. He would be almost as if he was weaving a giant patchwork quilt of words for himself. And there were other elements as well. How he appeared, how he spoke. She was always afraid he was going to ask a question that she wouldn't be able to answer. But so it's not as if she gave me a list of features, but the most salient for her was just that he was reading in this disordered and continuous way all the time. And I think also that he seemed to have dressed himself in the dark, which we all looked like as far as I can remember.
That's which is really interesting. I think from the research, we know that first of all, overall, people who later develop schizophrenia in particular, that there are these more subtle early indicators, even things like language anomalies, early motor abnormalities. There's a fascinating study where they looked at home videos of people who later developed schizophrenia as adults and their siblings who didn't. And there were actually differences that blinded coders could tell between things related to facial expression in the people who subsequently developed the schizophrenia. What we see as, sort of early warning signs or red flags in young people and adolescents are particularly suspiciousness. And so that can manifest in terms of starting to think that, people around you are talking about you negatively, saying bad things about you. That's at a very low level. And then at a more severe level, it's, really being convinced that somebody's out to hurt you. Or even like Michael thinking that, your parents have been replaced by Nazis. And then the other one that is particularly predictive of developing schizophrenia is this unusual thought content. So symptoms of, maybe thinking that other people can read your mind, or that, you're getting messages, say from, at a low level, this would be like a billboard. I think that billboard is maybe trying to tell me something. And then at a very severe level, I'm totally convinced that, this is, the FBI are following me, for example. So at also low levels, things like social withdrawal, social isolation, which could be a lot of things, could be depression, anxiety, and so forth, but certainly worth potentially getting evaluated.
Yeah.
Thank you both. We have another question here about, I just lost it. Just one moment. About, first of all, thanking you for sharing your journey and your work, both of you. And then asking if you have any advice for the younger generation of students pursuing the field of psychiatry, because it has vastly changed So I wonder if you could comment on that, and Jonathan, possibly kind of reiterate what the state of psychiatry was then and is now, and what you see the future, especially with schizophrenia.
Carrie, I'm sure you know a lot more about the pursuit of the profession today. I don't think there are enough psychiatrists who work in with severely ill people, and I would like to see medical schools who I would happily have them cover costs in exchange for people working in with really the most underserved population of all. What was interesting is that community mental health centers were initially supposed to have psychiatrists there, and then very rapidly that changed, and that changed the entire character of the pursuit. So I don't meet. I have met extraordinary youngish people. On an article I wrote, I called a fantastic street psychiatrist, as she called herself, young, but the fact checker, who was like 20, was like, she's in her 30s. That's not young. But in any case, I thought she was young. And she had chosen to combine her medical research at Harvard with working with people with severe mental illness. And I thought it was interesting whether this is now a new term of art. It wasn't community psychiatry, it was street psychiatry. And I thought that was interesting and important. And I don't really, I don't have a better answer than that. But I don't like the fact that it's very easy for hospitals to deny people admittance. I mean, during COVID, New York lost 1,000 hospital beds for people with severe mental illness. And it took like a couple of years to even get back to that level because they're chronically ill and they need a tremendous amount of care. And so I would love to see things restructured to some degree so that there is more and better ways of compensating people who work with people who don't compensate you directly at all.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everything Jonathan said. And, I think that a biopsychosocial approach is really the way that, would like to see it. It's not just about psychiatry. It's not just, and even you can have the best medication in the world, but which we don't. But if you did, it still can't guarantee that someone will take it. So I think that having that approach of working with a therapist, a treatment provider that you trust and that, will convince you that it's going to be better for you to take the medication and to help you, get a job, to have a meaningful life. I mean, those are all things that I think are really important with the treatment approach, and that, I think we need to see more of this, coordinated specialty care.
Yeah. And I should just also add, as somebody who told a story about what must seem like the worst thing that can happen, it's extraordinary, even when a guy who's written fantastic histories of community psychiatry and its failures, E. Fuller Torrey, um, he also wrote a book called Surviving Schizophrenia that's in about 7 or 8 editions. And one of the things he says is 20% of people who have a psychotic break and are truly diagnosed with schizophrenia won't have another one. And there are many people, increasing numbers of people, who live lives, much more full lives than they lived even when Michael was diagnosed, because even if there is better medication, there were certain things that didn't exist when he was initially getting medication. But it more and more in a quiet way, and those are never the people who you see in the newspapers every day. It's a thing. It is, in fact, something that there are not no answers. And so I really hope that young people are drawn to the field because they need help, and people need to know. I always try to add that, since the story I'm telling has a grim outcome, that it's not emblematic in that sense, but it is emblematic for many parents who speak to me after I've given a reading, in that it is their fear if they do not get the kind of care that they need, which is far too hard to get.
Right. It's the state, there aren't enough hospital beds. The prisons have become the largest psychiatric institutions in our country. We have a long ways to go to improve the system. But I want to thank you both. This was just a fascinating program. Jonathan, your book is so fascinating.
Thank you.
Everybody on the Friends of Semel board was reading it at the same time, and we were frantically looking to try to contact you, who you're not on social media, so it became a quest to find
I'm very
Jonathan
touched.
Rosen.
I'm very glad you found me. Thank you for
Oh,
persisting.
I'm very glad too.
I'm glad. I'm very, very glad. And Carrie, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us. And I think it's really important that people know the early signs to look for, because early treatment is so important, early interventions. So thank you both. This was
Thank you.
just an incredible presentation. And thank you to everybody that tuned in. Stay safe, be kind to people, and have a good rest of your evening. Good night, everybody.
Thank
night,
you all
everybody.
for being here. This was
Thank you.
wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. It was really amazing
Thank
to
you.
have a chance to talk with
Thank you
you.
so much.